welcome. I am so excited to be here. I'm Jennifer Paylor, and we are going to be having a great conversation today. Welcome to each and every one of you. I am joined here with Francisco here of this. He's the CEO of Cognitive Talent Solutions, and also with Diane Gherson, who is the former CHRO for IBM and now a senior lecturer for the Harvard Business School. As you all know, I'm excited about ONA. And this is going to be a wonderful conversation for each and every one of you who are looking for solutions and answers on things that can help us make these talent-based decisions and org design and job role design decisions. So without further ado, I would love to turn it over to Francisco and Diane to introduce themselves and also give a summary about what ONA is.
Sure. Hi, Jennifer. Really happy to be here with you and Diane. My name is Francisco Marin. I'm the co-founder and CEO of CTS. We are a people analytics startup focused on organizational network analysis. I come from Spain, originally based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Used to work at IBM for 5 years across different roles, and we're really happy to be here today with two former IBM colleagues.
Hi, I'm Diane Gherson, and as Jennifer pointed out, I used to be the head of HR at IBM and got really interested in organization network analysis as a more evidence-based way of making decisions. But as we go through the pandemic, it's becoming really obvious to me that this is such an important tool for managers for making the kinds of decisions that we all are needing to make around job design, work design, and inclusion. So that we can, make the right interventions and get the results that we're looking for. So that's why I am excited about ONA and really pleased to be on this seminar.
I see actually we have several people joining still, so please feel free to type in the comments where you're joining from. And please feel free if you have any comments or any questions at any time, type it on the chat and we will answer them as we go through the session. So maybe we could start providing a high-level overview of what is organizational network analysis for those of you that are not that familiar with it. So I'm actually going to share the screen and share a couple of slides. So for those of you who are not familiar with ONA, basically it's a people analytics method that allows you to analyze and visualize both formal and informal interactions that exist within the organization. It has been identified as one of the main trends in human capital over the last years. And based on the latest report from Mercer, already 44% of companies across the globe use ONA on a regular basis. So from a long-term perspective, what we are witnessing is a transition from formal, rigid, and slow frameworks to more informal, fluid, and agile ones. Traditionally, the value of the employees were determined exclusively by human capital metrics. For example, what are the skills, the role, the experience, or the knowledge that employees possessed. But now, social capital metrics are becoming increasingly important. For example, who reaches out to you to get information, to get personal support, to get technical support, or who you inspire within the organization. So it's in that combination of social and human capital metrics that ONA can add a lot of value. The social capital metrics by themselves, they don't tell us much, but in that complementarity of combining basically what is the resources that you have gained by being in a social network, that is the network of the organization, in this case, where you interact with your colleagues, and together with what is your experience, your role, your knowledge, that combination is really actionable and powerful. I really recommend all of you to check the latest article from Diane and Linda Gratton. It's called The Managers Can Do It All. And she explains really well how the role of the manager has faded over the 4 big movements of process engineering, digitization, agile work, and flexible work. In that context, still the figure of the leader is more important than ever in the current environment. People really need other people that will build them personal support and that this inspires them to be engaged in the organization, especially because of the psychological burden that the pandemic has put on all of us. And in that context, ONA gives you an X-ray technology that allows you to see what's happening in the organization and identify those people that organically are providing personal support, inspiring, providing technical support, and sharing information with the rest of the organization. Before we go into the conversation, I wanted to leave you with an example of what is a visualization of an informal network. So you can see, basically, we have different nodes who represent employees, and the edges indicate basically how people interact with each other. This can be done based on active data sources like online surveys, or based on passive data sources like Office 365, Slack, or other collaboration tools. But as you can see, basically, we have some people in the network who are central employee or informal leaders. These are people that independently of their role, or if they have a formal or a leadership role or not, and independently of whether they're using that influence in a negative way or in a positive way, they are very influential in the organization, and they can drag the organization becoming early adopters of strategic changes in a very effective manner. However, we also have peripheral employees, people that are disconnected from the organization, people that are not as influential, and who at some point can be at risk of exclusion or can also have a higher attrition risk. In the current environment, ONA is providing very actionable insights to understand how the pandemic has impacted the internal collaboration dynamics in companies. So, for example, we have found, based on the work that we do with different companies analyzing their digital footprint, that there has been a significant increase in the average daily number of emails sent per employee. When we compare 2019 and 2021, we sent 45% more emails on a daily basis. We also receive 81% more emails on a daily basis. So the volume of emails received and sent has increased significantly. We attended as much as 3 times more meetings than before. And this also has been accelerated with the adoption of hybrid and remote work models. And on the other hand, we're also having a bit shorter meetings. So the combination of the high volume of emails, more meetings, and shorter meetings has created also this always-on mentality where we are in front of the computer or in front of the phone. And this has a strong psychological burden on us because we know that work can get to us at any moment. And even if no transactional work is done, the fact that we are waiting to receive that update and we have to react to it, that can result in burnout risk, and it's something that we have to account for when designing jobs and organizations. So I will leave it there, and looking forward to hear the thoughts of Jennifer and Diane on how organizational network analysis can play a significant role in the org job design.
Thank you, Francisco, and thank you all for joining. There are more joining in, and thank you for your comments. And please put your questions in there. If you have any questions or thoughts as we go along, I'll be moderating the conversation today. So please let us know what you think. So you mentioned, Diane, Francisco mentioned a lot around, hybrid work and the way work is evolving since the pandemic. And I'm just curious about overall your view and what type of solutions do you think ONA can help us solve now?
Yeah, well, look, I think we've put managers in a really tough spot in that many organizations have pulled back from the kind of the edicts around when people come to the office, and they're leaving it up to the manager. And that's hard for a manager because they're going to have people who may not like their decisions, may not want to live with their decisions. And yet there's a lot of data out there to support managers around when people tend to be collaborating the most, not just what time of day or what days, but also during different cycles of the year. We all know that we go through different cycles in each of our areas. And also, we don't just collaborate inside of our unit. We collaborate very much outside of our units, right? And our managers may not even be aware of that because it's virtual. It's not like they're hanging around our office. So there is a need for the manager to have some evidence of, where collaboration tends to be the most intense. And this I think is a wonderful way of looking at it. It's like an X-ray of the organization. and the interactions that are taking place. So I think that's really phenomenal. And even if the decision's being made at the organization level or a location level, that will give that leader that kind of insight. And then, they can share the data with their employees and say, what do you think? And get employees to work not just from their own preconceptions or their own biases, but actually to understand, okay, well, there is a value to coming in for this kind of work, or, there seem to be these core hours, and I will work with those core hours to be available on my laptop if I'm working remotely or whatever. So I think those are insights that we can all be working with. The other thing that's really, I think, something that Francisco touched on, which I think is pretty exciting, is that it also enables us to think about role sharing. In today's world, where a lot of women are starting to realize that they don't have to work, full time. They may need to economically, but they may decide that role sharing, at least for a while, to, as they go through the various changes that the pandemic has wrought for us, may be a good answer. And we've learned that we can virtually pair people on jobs. And again, this would help us figure out which are those jobs, what kind of role sharing is it across time zones, what would work. And I think that's a very exciting development that we can be using ONA for as we kind of come through the pandemic as well.
Wow, I like that idea of role sharing and being able to get more data evidence on how you design the work, design the jobs. And even when it comes to gender diversity, women have different choices. So that's a good idea to think about, how do we share work together? How do we collaborate differently? And you mentioned, Diane, it's not just something for organizations, it's for the person too. Getting feedback as an individual, really assessing your network. So that's good to hear. It's another tool for diversity and inclusion. So thank you for that one.
Yeah.
Francis.
And I think you can probably spot burnout too, right? I mean, we looked at that graph that Francisco showed us, and there may be some people who are just too much at the intersection, right, of too many networks. And it could just be their job design is not optimal, right? That maybe by splitting away something from that job, you would take some of the onus of communication off of that individual. So I think it's also a great one to be able to spot burnout problems.
You're hitting on a very important topic with well-being and burnout and how work has changed. And so one of the things I'm starting to see, Diane, and would love you and Francisco's ideas on this is, sometimes when people are overutilized, it's hard for people to see that they are carrying the load for so many people. And then there are others who are underutilized. Maybe they are just out here, no one can see that they might have capacity. So I'm starting to see the intensity of work, the capacity is exploding around. And this tool, this ONA tool, can give orgs visibility into who's overloaded, who does not have capacity, who has capacity, because we always think about, like in my role in learning, talent, and culture, there's this big push around skills and capability, but also you brought up a point around capacity and burnout and well-being. How can ONUS really, really help us dig into that and transform it for the future of work?
It's a really great question. And, there are lots of reasons why people are under capacity. And I think one of the findings that Francisco has had in his work with ONA is that recently onboarded people have been onboarded into organizations since the pandemic began. Obviously, they were onboarded virtually in most cases, are less likely to be embedded in informal communication networks. In other words, if I have a problem, I'm going to call you because we work together in the office and I know you. I'm not going to reach out to that new person who may even have taken your job, right? You may have moved on to something else because I don't know them. And so they're being they're being underutilized and not part of the networks, and of course at risk to leave even more so. But this I think is a great example of how we've got to be able to capture that. Managers may not be aware that this is going on because after all, these people are showing up to the formal meetings, they're all there. It's the informal interactions that cause that undercapacity, underutilization, but also lack of inclusion.
Yes, I think that ONA is a very powerful tool to unveil both diversity and inclusion dynamics that happen within the organization. Sometimes are invisible to us, right? And also to prevent or mitigate at least potential burnout risk scenarios. So when it comes to diversity and inclusion specifically, we found, for example, that Black and African American employees are 2.3 times more likely to be disconnected from the organization, meaning occupying peripheral role in the bottom 20% of influence in the organization. And that can easily lead to a situation where that person is detached from the network, and that increases the turnover risk of that person. It has a negative impact on engagement and on the overall employee experience. We also, when we look at inspiration dynamics by gender and ethnicity, we found some very interesting patterns. For example, we found that Black and African American women were almost exclusively inspired by other women, especially Black and African American. But if you don't have Black female leaders in the organization, it's very difficult that those other Black female employees are going to get inspired. And this is something that shows in this analysis in a very clear manner. There are very clear patterns. When it comes to burnout risk specifically, one of the main indicators we should look for is the percentage of collaboration outside of working hours. When people have to take the work home, and this is very easy to do when we're working remotely, because before we were in the office and we kind of like tend to disconnect when we were getting home. But now basically those barriers are blurred. So it's very easy, as I was explaining earlier, to be in that always on mentality where you can cover work at 7, 8, 9 p.m. And that's as the main contributor to burnout risk. Again, even if you don't do any actual work, the fact that you are psychologically ready to reply to an email, you can have exactly the same level of burnout risk. It's pretty much like what happens, for example, the reaction in your brain is very similar when you look at the phone or when you are using the phone. So even if you are not with the phone itself, the fact that you have the phone close to you, it impacts your brain activity. So it's pretty much the same. But then also another use case that I think is very relevant nowadays is onboarding. Our research has shown that people that are for less than 6 months in the organization have now, with the pandemic, less than 60% less interactions than before the pandemic in 2019. And this is because when people join the organization, they don't have face-to-face interactions, or they have fewer face-to-face interactions in hybrid work environments. So if you position those informal leaders as buddies or mentors of new hires, that accelerates the time to productivity of those new hires, meaning the time that they need to reach an optimal level of productivity compared to their peers. And that also reduces the turnover risk, which is a main challenge that companies are facing with the Great Resignation, and it enhances the overall employee experience. And the cool thing actually is that when you combine organizational network analysis with artificial intelligence, all these introductions between bodies and the new hires happen automatically. The algorithms themselves already can introduce the two people based on the profile that has been matched, and can schedule the meeting based on their availability and check whether that meeting took place. So the whole process of onboarding and preventing those people from getting isolated can be fully automated.
Well,
Francisco, based on what you're saying, it made me think about how we have, a lot of people who say, look, I spend all my time, working globally. And so why should I have to come to the office? And I think a lot of companies have really struggled with that. Should we make different rules for different people, and where do we draw the line, and so forth? But, using ONA, you could even say, you could see, look, okay, this person does have a global job, but 25% of their interactions are with people in their location. And that's high enough that we do need to say that the job isn't fully remote, and we'll have to think through that, right? maybe those 25% interactions could be offloaded to someone else, or maybe they're just integral to getting the job done. But it gives us data, whereas I think before there was a sense of, well, listen, unless I complain, I'll have to show up to the office every day. Not that that's the case, but there is this view that there isn't data in the company to guide decisions that make sense for me and my job. And it'll be in some way anecdotal, or it'll be based on the whims of the CEO. And that's a terrible place to be when this is such an important topic for everyone. And ONA gives us the data, and then we can share the data and help people understand the decisions that we're making.
Diane, you bring up a very good point, and I'm a huge fan of culture, like interactions. We've been talking about emails and things. So it's two things I have in mind to just pick your brain on, because I was at IBM for 23 years, and I saw you, Diane, really lead the work of the future, taking IBM into technology and how do you transform HR. Like, I've never seen a CHRO do that so quickly over the last 20 years. So there are some CHROs I'm seeing on the chat here, and these are new tools that I don't think have been explored, or some people may not have heard about how you apply these things, like when you applied Agile in HR. So ONA, again, is I think a tool or solution. Right now, companies are asking that question. Do we force people back into the office? How do we bring people back into office? So some of those mindsets, could you share, Diane, about the mindset of a CHRO, and how do you lean into these new tools that they probably haven't even heard of?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think that mindset has to be co-creation, right? And gone are the days when, the edict comes on high, and we've actually seen that completely, fall apart, right? Particularly on Wall Street. And it's just not, it's not meaningful in a world where everyone really expects interaction and feedback loops. They got it on Facebook, they got it on social media, they should be getting it at work too. And so I think co-creation is the mindset of the CHRO, and it needs to be fact-based, but it also needs to be principle-based. And so, so that's the CHRO needs to share, here are our principles, and, they're the ones that are guiding our work together. And now let's take a look at the facts, and let's design something that's going to work for everyone. And it won't work for absolutely everyone. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like you can do that, but at least everyone can understand, all right, I've seen the data, I'm an outlier. This may not work for me. I'll have to look for a different job or look in a different company, but I can understand why they made the decisions they made, and I was part of that. And I think that's as good as it can get. But I do think that the danger that CHROs are getting themselves into right now is that they're leaving too much up for grabs. And people need a little more certainty. They don't want their manager to be the only one making the decisions, because their manager doesn't know everything about their interactions outside of their unit. And increasingly, people are working in an agile way. They're working on projects with others, and so forth. And it's the organization is a network after all. It's not a silo. And so to use organization network analysis to help with that, as opposed to just looking up and down the hierarchy and asking people in the hierarchy to make decisions, I think is a really, really important way to operate.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
We have an interesting question in the chats, actually, from Larry Schillmeister. He asked, how does this guide org and process design to meet cost constraints, right? This is a very important question, because one of the challenges of organizational network analysis is that because it has so many use cases and many of them are quite intangible, sometimes it's challenging to go through the internal process sale to explain how this impacts the bottom line of the company, right? So I would like to mention just very high level 2 or 3 scenarios where you can actually use ONA in the process of org and process design to meet cost constraints. One then is, for example, if you're in a situation where you have an organization that is oversized, and you have multiple layers, multiple managerial layers, and you're in a situation, for example, you have 9 layers, and you have to let go of 3 of them. the question is, which specific layers do you have to let go? And definitely you want to let go the layers that will have the least impact on the operations of the company. So one thing you can do is both through active and passive ONA, meaning through the online surveys and by looking at collaboration dynamics in Office 365, you can check how these different managerial layers interact with each other. So for example, if layer 1 is reporting to layer 2 and layer 2 is reporting to layer 3, but layer 1 happens to have a lot of interaction with layer 3, meaning that they are actually to some extent bypassing that layer. That layer that is being bypassed is a target for that downsizing that would have least operational impact on the dynamics of the company. Again, it's not that you have to make the decision exclusively based on the results from ONA. There are many other metrics that are very important. For example, what specific skills do employees have that we have to retain in the organization? But it's a very powerful complement to existing decision-making processes. So this is one example. Another example is also when you are implementing any type of technology, this can be like that is replacing, especially if you are implementing centralized technology that is replacing legacy systems that are scattered across the organization. Sometimes some companies have more tools than employees. We've seen that quite often. These new technology deployments can be very long and difficult to deal with. And if you position the informal leaders as the early adopters of such changes, for example, super users when deploying SAP, or even cultural ambassadors in new cultural changes, only 3% of informal leaders can influence up to 85% of the remaining population and accelerate strategic change adoption by 40%. So when you're looking at the 18-month deployment, cutting that by 40% can have a significant impact on cost constraint. And it can help you realize the cost savings of that implementation faster and earlier.
Okay. And Diane, to that point around cost savings, and just, sometimes I've seen in HR where some of these HR processes or functions have been seen as cost centers or just overhead. And two things you mentioned earlier around being able to see or have that X-ray vision into the flow of work and how work is getting done. And you mentioned database decisions. And so now one of the things that's happening when we move from that great resignation to this great reshuffle, talent is starting to really look for companies where they can have that work-life balance. They can have the flexibility you talked about. They can fit in with the values and the principles. So from like an HR perspective, when we think about talent, sometimes we don't see them in their context, in their organization. We'll see them as an individual isolated with skills and capabilities. How might organizations really explore looking at a tool like this, database tool, to really see who are the key talent? Do they have the network? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, you're raising a really good point. And this isn't on the point of cost constraints. And we need to hear from Larry if we answered his question. But I think the issue of who are the informal leaders is important, because leaders in today's world need to have followership. And too often, again, the leadership development guys rely on it's kind of the wrong information to determine who the high potential people are. And maybe it's just the traditional way of looking at things, right? But it could be that these are the people who've had, great performance, as an example, but they might have had great performance at the cost of followership. And they aren't the people that are really making a difference in the performance. There may have been others in the organization, however, that did. And so, to be able to spot who are the people that others go to for advice, that others go to when they are in, dealing with a problem that they can't solve, those are the people that have followership for some reason, right? Now, maybe they won't be a great people leader. Maybe they're going to be a great leader of work. And we need to make that distinction. we do need to use data to understand these informal leaders, because at the end of the day, when you're trying to make change, those are the people who are going to be able to help you as an organization. They're the culture carriers because they have people coming to them. And in a world where so much work is no longer taking place on premise, you want to know who those people are. And if you can place them in positions where they have more formal authority, then, you know, the culture carriers will be that much more effective.
Wow. So it sounds like people are doing a lot of work, like activities and different things, and we need to be able to see where that's happening. They're connecting across networks and they're building their informal influence across networks. Could you share a little bit about the activities versus outcome? I love your perspective on that, because I think it's important now with so much work going on, people working from home, no one is seeing when you're on or off. And what are your thoughts on activity versus outcome?
Yeah, well, this is obviously, you know, how we need to manage. If we weren't doing it before, it's being done now because you can't actually see how people are getting their work done. I'm a little fearful of the sort of the monitoring, you know, approaches, digital monitoring approaches that some companies are putting in because they don't have sufficient confidence, essentially, in their managers' ability to manage to outcomes. So I do think this is something that every company needs to be investing in, because if you are doing digital monitoring and spying on your people, you know, it's going to inspire a lack of trust on both sides, and it's downhill from there. We all know that when things go south, they go really south. So, you know, so how do we equip managers to manage the outcomes? This is a really, really important topic, I think, for any HR organization to be dealing with. And one of the things that I've seen ONA do is it can spot where you've got people swirling, right? They're swirling, they're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And as a manager, if you can see that, you can actually do an intervention and say, what's going on? How can I help? What are the barriers? And kind of unlock the problem, right? And in a world where you're working in the office, you're much more likely to be able to see it physically. And people are more likely to drop in and, you know, kind of tell you something's going on. It's less likely when you're working virtually, or if you have a virtual team. And so, you know, so I do think that that's important. Virtual teams also have a tendency to go down rat holes more easily. And why is that? It's because when you're face-to-face in a meeting, you have many more cues to see that this person is really checking out. They don't think it's a good idea. They're just, you know, like, you know, mailing it in. But when you're on a video call, or when you're dealing with each other on Slack or email, there's a tendency to go, well, I don't really think it's a good idea, but okay, you know, I'll be on the meeting, or, you know, I read that email, but they don't participate as actively. And so you're missing out on people who don't really have that strong enough bond of trust to say, this is a horrible idea. Let's just ditch this, you know, and move on. And so they hang on to ideas for longer. And that's not good for productivity. Managers need to be on top of that and really help people speak up when they feel like something isn't going to work, so that you can move on. You know, the most important thing to do is fail fast, right? And move on quickly. And so to be able to see that in the way people are interacting, I think is going to be very important for managers.
It's super interesting. And I love how Diane explains it, because she looks at it from the perspective of the CHRO. I can just really complement what she's saying, just with specific data that we see in the way we work with companies, right? So on the, for example, on the topic that Diane brought up about hypo identification, we are seeing that 2/3, 66% of high performers are not recognized as informal leaders by their peers. Again, as Diane explained, it doesn't mean that a person that is not an informal leader should not be a high performer, right? Ideally, for formal leadership roles, you will need to have also informal leadership, because otherwise you won't be able to do your job effectively, especially in hybrid and remote work environments in the current scenario. But always, again, to complement human capital metrics with social capital metrics, not replace human capital metrics with social capital metrics. Also, when it comes to understanding ONA and its relation to outcomes, I think it's very important to separate the two of them, because sometimes we can fall in the trap of thinking, okay, because a person or a team is sending more emails, those people or teams are more productive. It's not always the case. When people work remotely, they tend to send more emails, as we have seen, both receive and send more emails, have more meetings, shorter meetings. So more activity doesn't necessarily translate into more productivity. Sometimes teams that have less productivity but take time to rest and recover themselves are more productive than others. However, what you want to see is if you have defined specific outcomes and key performance indicators, and you see that some teams are consistently achieving or overachieving and other teams are underachieving, you can look at the collaboration dynamics of those teams and see if there is a pattern. So maybe you'll find that teams that do not achieve as much operate with organizational silos, or they have a lower average number of interactions per employee. And these are the things that you can tackle in a proactive basis, identifying organizational silos and bottlenecks. The concept of bottleneck as well is a bit tricky, because when we identify, and actually for those of you that haven't seen at the beginning of the session, the network, I would like to bring this up. Just give me just a second over here. And I would like to show you exactly how a network can be identified in terms of silos and bottlenecks. So let me, again, share the screen here. You see, when we have a network, algorithms can automatically already identify organizational silos and bottlenecks. So if we are looking, for example, at a particular department, and you want to see, well, these are people that are working remotely, I want to see really how they are organized themselves. You see, algorithms allow us to see that we have a group of 4 people that are creating a silo. Sometimes we have a situation like here, for example, where a person can be creating a bottleneck. But this is a very tricky situation, because it can be a breach or a bottleneck. A bottleneck means that this person is somehow using their influence or their formal authority to prevent these people from interacting with the rest of the organization. But it can also happen that this is a person that is actually acting as a breach, proactively creating a link between that group and the rest of the organization. So we really have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. But the cool thing is that technology already identifies automatically these communities. It can analyze the composition of the silos, and it can recommend specific interventions on how to mitigate them. For example, connecting the informal leaders from each silo with each other and making those connections automatically. So we're really living in a very interesting moment where we can embed technology with social capital metrics to suggest and implement interventions in a totally automated way.
Yeah, I love that idea of how the social metrics will complement human capital metrics. And to that point, you know, people are in the process of switching companies, if you will. Companies are struggling with attrition and this great reshuffle. And I do see how ONA can really help. Look, if you recruit someone, and Diane, and both you, Francisco and Diane, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. When you recruit someone who has been known in the industry, who has a lot of skills, experience, how can ONA help you start to assess some of their social networks and things? Because people bring along their networks with them or not. And I've seen studies where some people have left companies and they say, well, I'm going to go to another company, and they really believe in their skills. But when they get there, they don't really do well because they actually don't have that network that they had before. And even when I moved to chapter 2, to my chapter 2, that's one of the things I thought about is, wow, how am I going to really diversify my network at Capgmini really quickly, because I spent so many years at IBM. So Diane, your thoughts on, with talent moving in and out of companies, key leadership roles, leaders are bringing their networks or not. What are your thoughts on these social metrics that Francisco was talking about?
Yeah, well, look, you know, one of the things that I found really helpful when I took on a leadership role at IBM was I was shown my network. In other words, how was I interacting with others? compared to people who were my peers. And I realized that I wasn't as strong at building networks in certain areas compared to some of my peers. And it was a good wake-up call for me. It was a very dense network in some areas, but very sparse in others. And I realized that for me to be effective at the leadership level that I was at, I needed to strengthen my network in specific areas. And it was a great wake-up call for me. So I think that is something that's helpful. It might be something that a company would consider when they hire. As you pointed out, as Capgemini hired you, maybe they could have shown you, here's your network, Jennifer, and now let's compare you to other partners who have similar responsibilities. And let's see where you're not as dense as you should be in your networks. And then, let's put together a plan for you to solve that, because we know that, we just compared you to some really effective partners. For you to be as effective as them, you're going to need to shore that up. Again, it just, I think you made a really great distinction between human capital and social capital. Social capital is key in today's world, in today's workplace, because we're not all working in the same building, and we're not working in a hierarchy. We're working in a network, and in a network, social capital is king.
I
love that. Social capital is king.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. We're moving from a role first approach to a network first approach, and in that context, I think, ultimately there are several use cases across which ONA can add value, right? But looking also at what is happening right now from a technology perspective, with things like, for example, like blockchain, where we are having now decentralized autonomous organizations. Even at CTS, for example, we are a company incorporated in Delaware, but we are also structuring the blockchain as a decentralized autonomous organization. So this is something here in Silicon Valley we are seeing as a very real thing, right? As companies change their structure, networks are going to become increasingly important. But I think that one of the, sorry, can you please, Diane, just pick up again, because I had thought, but I have so many use cases in the mind right now that I lost the thought that I wanted to have. Can you pick up again the topic that you were mentioning earlier?
The one about social capital?
Yes, but it's a specific question that Jennifer had for you.
And let me just tag on to it, but maybe we can evolve it, Diane.
Oh, yeah, I remember it right now. The question was like, what happens when a person goes to a new company, and how quickly is that person able to replicate the network, right? This is what I wanted to say. So one of the indicators we look at when identifying high potentials with the help of ONA is the ability to quickly grow your network within the first years that you're in the organization. So for example, if you spot an informal leader that is for 10 years in the organization or 30 years, is a manager, it's very important to compare apples with apples and oranges with oranges. So the benchmarking insights that Diane was referring to are really important in something that can be provided automatically when running ONA. So for example, again, if you're a manager for 30 years in the organization, you want to see how you are performing in terms of inspiration, personal support, technical support, compared to other managers that have a similar number of years of service. However, you might not want to compare yourself with a person that doesn't have a formal leadership role and has been for 5 months in the company. However, it sometimes happens that people that are for less than, for example, 5 years in the organization and don't have a formal leadership role have more influence sometimes than managerial roles with more level of experience. And those are the specific cases that you want to see to spot high potential employees. Those people that become informal leaders despite not having a formal leadership role and despite being for a short period of time in the organization are people that definitely should be considered for leadership development programs as high potential employees. And it's so nice to see actually that IBM has been really one of the pioneer companies. Some thought leaders in the industry like Rob Cross used to work at IBM as well. The whole founding team at IBM, at CTS used to work at IBM. And I think that, in some regard, IBM has been one of the pioneer companies in terms of integrating social capital metrics in the managerial structure and the managerial operations. Sorry for the lapsus, right? Just so many ideas It was so interesting what I was sharing. I had too many ideas in the mind at the
No,
same time.
it's fine. And then we got a question on it. That's where I learned ONA from IBM. So it was just like mining for gold, and I struck gold when I discovered ONA. And I have a question here from Tekla. Diane, when we were talking about social capital and human capital, there's a question here around, do we still call it external eminence? So we used to talk about leaders and their external eminence. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's a particular term that applies when you're using social media externally to amp up your profile. Particularly if you're in a role that can support the company that you're working for, right? So, yeah, I think external eminence has a little more value attached to it. I think social capital is perhaps more volume than it is value. Although there are ways that we can measure the value too, but I think external eminence would suggest, that you would have followership. So I guess that would be volume. Yeah, it probably is the same thing. It's probably a modern way of thinking about it, except social capital applies internally as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like it applies internally in the work that we're doing. So here's another question around that area. I know that some companies, when we're talking about outcomes, we're talking about the flow of work and how we see the work happening. There are people who may have, a big network. And sometimes when you're developing talent, I hear employees saying, well, I don't want to seem like it's a threat, if I have external eminence or social capital. And so what do you think about companies using ONA, to your point, Diane, to help people look at their network, get that feedback so they can actually see where they have challenges. And then if they build it up, that person does become more valuable. So what are some of your thoughts on that? Because I think that there are leaders and managers who are holding on to talent and not letting them mobilize and grow and things like that. We're always going to be dealing with, managers holding on to their talent and not letting them mobilize. What are your thoughts on using ONA to help that?
It's a great question. I mean, that's the old style manager, right? The old style manager was the broker of talent and their careers, right? I'll tell you when you're ready to move on, and I'll get you your next promotion and blah, blah, blah. Well, LinkedIn just blew that one away. If someone can reach out underneath a manager in LinkedIn and let them know that they're a great match for a job in, company X, then that manager has just lost that power. And that's been going on for quite a while. So that manager is no longer effective. And that manager is increasingly having to actually sit down and have good career conversations with the individual. And if the individual says, look, it's time for me to move on, that manager at their peril will say, you've got to stay, right? Their job is to help them stay inside the company. And I think, the reason that you're seeing these new, the companies implement career marketplaces is for that reason. It's because that manager used to just look at their network and go, well, Susie over here might need you. I spoke with them yesterday, let's get you placed. And the individual is like, well, I've got all of LinkedIn that I'm looking at, and you've got this one job. So, so the company really does need to offer really their matches. And that's what we did at IBM, right? We said, you go online and it says, hey, we've got 6 matches for people with your particular skills. Do you want to apply for them? There's a 60% match on this one and 90% match on this one and so forth. And it was, it was always up, right? There was always there. And so people always felt like they were in demand. They might not go for it, but they felt like they were in demand. And then when they were ready, there would be the matches. So, so I think that has definitely changed the role of the manager as hoarder of talent. The other thing that, we all need to do is we need to reward managers for the moving on of their people to better opportunities, as opposed to only rewarding them for retention of their people inside their unit. And I think that's a way of saying, hey, your job is to develop your people so they can reach their potential. And that's an important metric.
Wow, rewarding mobility, that's good. Innovation. Francisco, how can they use ONA to help see those points where they can mobilize people using ONA? Because I love that. Rewarding mobility, we got to put that in place.
Yeah, I think definitely one of the main challenges for organizations, they have to change the performance methods, like specifically for managers, and integrate social capital metrics into your quarterly goals, for example, right? For managers to take seriously social capital metrics, they need to see that it's part of their performance system. Otherwise, the indirect message that the organization is sending is this is a nice thing to have, but you still have to focus on traditional metrics. With the situation that Diane was describing, right? With the manager can try to broker the growth of the employee within the organization, but you can go to LinkedIn, you can connect with 100,000 people across the globe. That is because LinkedIn is a social network. It's decentralized in nature, but the organizations still are centralized in nature. So it's very interesting what happens when something that is decentralized interacts with something that is centralized, right? In this case, for example, what we're doing with ONA is trying to get the structure of the company, at least the collaboration structure, to match what is already happening on the outside. Because again, when people go out to LinkedIn, they don't have any restriction to interact with anybody. Why they should have any restriction to interact with people within their own organization? This can be extrapolated as well. For example, what happens with a social network that is decentralized when it is managed by a centralized board of directors. There are some incentives that clash just because the structure of both things are just different in nature. Here in Silicon Valley, for example, we see also an example of that. When startups are at very early stage, they are pretty decentralized in nature because basically you just hang out with who you want and work on who you want. And this is really very trust-based. But as you grow the organizations, then centralized dynamics start to appear. So in terms of rewarding mobility, yes, I'm all in favor of enabling people to work with whom they want on what they want. Of course, when you scale up, when you manage an organization of hundreds of thousands of employees, you have to have some order in place and some structure, right? But as much as you can reward internal mobility, ultimately people are the most productive when they work on something they're passionate about. And that's something I've learned having spent time in the corporate world and then in the startup world. I've seen some of the different dynamics, and I'm convinced really that one of the secrets why startups become so productive is because people work on something that they're passionate about with people that they want to work. But those are dynamics that can be replicated in big multinationals as well. You just have to have the tools in place like ONA to understand those dynamics. And bringing up a earlier topic that Diane mentioned that I think is very important, it's the topic of collaboration overload. It has been, for example, defended by people like Rob Cross. This is a real phenomenon. People can collaborate too much, get overwhelmed, they end up leaving the company. And if you are an informal leader and you end up leaving the company, you will have a greater impact on the morale of your immediate network. However, we have to be very careful with playing the role of deciding how much a person should collaborate. The power of ONA comes from the fact that you are unveiling organic collaboration dynamics. And as far as you just let those collaboration dynamics grow, meaning, okay, as an informal leader, I'm going to empower that informal leader. Or I see a peripheral employee, I'm going to help that person get reconnected. But in the moment that you go in the direction of, I see an informal leader, a person that is collaborating, but that person is collaborating too much, are going to prevent or encourage that person to collaborate less. In some cases, it might be healthier, but in some cases, you might be really going against the organic interactions they use in the organization. I don't think that's a positive thing, but it's really all about really determining on a case-by-case basis when it makes sense to make an intervention and when it just makes sense to just go with the flow of what you are seeing in the organization. It's not an easy thing. It's a completely new concept.
Wonderful. I know we have a few moments left, and I want to ask the final question. And I'm hearing that this will work for small companies, startups, even large scale enterprises. So some people here have never used ONA, Diane. They have never thought about it in HR. and whether they're small or large companies. And they were trying to figure out, where do I start? Is there a process in HR where I can just try this out? And it's a common process that most companies have. What would be your suggestions to small and large companies about where to start in ONA?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. Of course, you should start with what hurts, right? And is it that you have a problem in front of you around how you're going to design or make decisions about hybrid work and the future workplace arrangements? If that's the case, then I would start there, right? And work with a sponsor who really wants to share the data and use the data to make the decision. So, if that's the problem, it could be one around onboarding, right? We really want to understand where we've done successful and less successful onboarding so that we can fix it as we continue to hire people virtually and do the right interventions. It could be inclusion. It could be that we've done quite well with representation. We've improved our diversity representation, but we still sense that there's an inclusion issue, that the people that we've hired who are African-American, for example, are not included in the informal networks that are part of the lifeblood of this company. And where do we have the issues that we need to, as Francisco pointed out, do some better pairing for mentors and coaches. And where are the managers that could be doing a better job of nudging that kind of interaction? So I think those are issues that companies are facing, and you've got to start with the issue. What's the problem we're trying to solve, and then define an ONA intervention that could help solve that problem.
Wonderful. Francisco, any thoughts from you?
Yes, I think that sponsorship is key. Most companies start with a pilot of 400 to 1,000 employees. But ultimately, if you really want social capital metrics to be embedded in the performance structure of organizations, you have to run it at organization level. So it's very important to get a sponsor that either is, ideally if it's the CHRO, but a person that has a global scope and that is going to be able to lead effectively. There are many dimensions that can be challenging in these type of projects, right? Interaction with labor relations, multiple locations being involved. So definitely, I mean, a pilot with 400, 1,000 employees for a big multinational is more than enough. Tackling a specific problem. Again, the main challenge of ONA is that it has so many use cases that we can get lost in the forest. So understand what is the pressing need, the strategic imperative that is the most important for your company at the moment. Understand how ONA can tackle it specifically and sell that within the organization. And I think we are witnessing a very interesting moment in history. I think that networks are going to play an increasingly important role in helping us understand and manage increasingly decentralized environments. And I look forward to working with all of you really to make it happen.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Francisco, and thank you, Diane. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I'm walking away with a lot of takeaways, and I love that we can take ONA to help us solve the most pressing things, the things that hurt. So really think about where it hurts. I'm looking forward to seeing the use cases that you have, Francisco, at Cognitive Talent Solutions. There are use cases for all of the pain points here in the industry. Now is a good time for new tools, thinking about innovation and how we create the best workplaces for people in the world. Francisco, I'll let you wrap up with how to contact Cognitive Talent Solutions.
Yes, please, if anybody wants to learn more about ONA, feel free to reach out to any of us at any time. This is all about building a community and spread the word, help people understand how new technologies can help make better decisions that are more empathetic with people. This is basically needed in the current environment. Let's not forget, pandemic is still not over. People have incredibly big psychological burden, still a lot of problems with attrition, burnout risk, managing hybrid and work environments. And these are technology that really can help you across multiple use cases. And for companies that are starting with people analytics and think, this is a too sophisticated technology for me at the moment. Let's not forget, some projects that might look more simple at first sight because of the maintenance that they require, they can become really cumbersome. So when we are looking at the ONA implementation, we're looking at a 4-week implementation. It takes you 2-3 weeks to run a survey. It takes you 30 minutes to plug the API from Office 365, and then you can get insights across the whole organization. So it's important for companies to really just jump, as Diane said earlier, right? Fail fast, get the lessons learned as soon as possible, and iterate as fast as possible. That's one of the things that they do very well here in Silicon Valley with the startups that multinationals need to start doing as well. Try these technologies, learn from the mistake as soon as possible, and then, you know, by the point that you go to a larger project, you are going to know exactly what is it that you want to do and how you want to do it. But don't get intimidated by sometimes being too technical or too complex. It's not really that complex.
Wonderful.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.